Well, so good to be with you virtually today, and it's a joy and an honor to bring God's Word to you here this morning. And if you're tuning in and you haven't been with us before, and if we haven't met yet, my name is Pastor Marcus, and I get to be one of the pastors here on staff at ULC. And this week we're continuing on in our series Face to Face, as we are looking at Paul's first letter to the church in a city called Thessalonica. And as we take a look at that this morning, and we look at chapter 2, I am reminded of a leadership book that came out in 2009 by the British author and motivational speaker and marketing guru by the name of Simon Sinek. And this book that Sinek wrote is called simply Start With Why. And the whole concept of this book is really encapsulated by this image that you should be able to see on your screen right here that Sinek calls the golden circle. And the whole idea for Sinek is that the best, longest lasting, most influential organizations in the world, they all sort of work from the inside out. They start with why before they get to what it is they actually do. So before they talk about the products that they sell or what they're trying to market to their listeners, they begin with why they even exist in the first place. Sinek kind of sums it up when he writes this. He says, when most organizations or people think, act, or communicate, they do so from the outside in, from what to why. And for good reason. They go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. We say what we do, we sometimes say how we do it, but we rarely say why we do what we do. But not the inspired companies, not the inspired leaders. Every single one of them, regardless of their size or their industry, thinks, acts, and communicates from the inside out. And so here's the claim that Simon Sinek is making. He is saying that every organization, the most influential organizations, whether it's a Fortune 500 company or it's a small church in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the most influential organizations, they all begin with why they exist. What is our purpose? What is our reason for being? What is the thing that gets us out of bed every single morning? And he suggests that idea is far more important than the what that we actually do, the thing that we sell, or the message that we're communicating. That the most central thing about the most influential organizations is that they communicate why they exist in the first place. Now here's why I think what Sinek has to say relates to what Paul writes to the Thessalonians in chapter 2. Is because we see Paul here kind of follows this outline. And actually, it's not just here. We see throughout the New Testament is that as the writers of the New Testament, as they talk about the things that the church is called to do, the what of the church, or the how of the church, they all point to a deeper why, a deeper thing about who we are, who we've been called to be, and why we exist in the first place. And so this morning, classic Pastor Gabe style 3-point structure, just simply following Sinek's outline. The why of Paul's ministry, the how of Paul's ministry, and then finally the what of Paul's ministry. Let's go ahead and dive in here this morning. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul writes this. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and had been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. Now, notice here that as Paul writes, he begins by talking about how their ministry to the Thessalonians, it was actually filled with a great deal of conflict. And what Paul's talking about here, it actually correlates directly with what Luke records about Paul's ministry in Acts chapter 16 and the first part of 17. As we see that as Paul and Silas were ministering to people in the region of Philippi, that they were met with a great deal of controversy, that as Paul cast out a demon from this slave girl who was being exploited by her owners, they were then cast into prison. And there in prison, they actually converted the jailer to the Christian faith. And finally, they're released from prison and they move on from Philippi to the city called Thessalonica. Now, if you read Acts chapter 17, you'll notice that the first part of their ministry actually embodies a great deal of success. Listen to what Luke records in Acts chapter 17. He says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, 'This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ.' And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women." So the first part, as they first enter the city of Thessalonica, Paul and Silas, they go into the synagogue, and Paul's sort of the guest preacher for 3 consecutive Sundays in the synagogue there. And as Paul reasons with them and argues from the Scriptures, he actually draws many of the people there in the synagogue to the Christian faith. So many of the Jewish believers, we're told many of the Gentiles even are included in this, and many of the leading women of the synagogue, they're all brought to believe that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. But after he experiences some success on the front end of the ministry, notice what happens next. Acts chapter 17, verse 5. "But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, 'These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus.' And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go." So after initially encountering some success in ministry, what follows? What follows is this conflict that Paul speaks of in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. That there's basically an angry mob, a violent mob rises up, and they're trying to find Paul and Silas, and they're drawing these people who've come to the Christian faith out and accusing them of treason because they're proclaiming that Jesus is Lord and not Caesar. Now here's why I bring this up. Here's why this is so important for what Paul writes in chapter 2 here. You see, if ever there was a time for Paul to compromise his message, to back down, it was here. If ever there was a time for Paul to say, "Oh, no, it's not that scandalous, it's not that specific, there's perhaps many ways," it was here. It was in the face of this conflict. Right? If Paul was in error or deceiving people, this would have been the precise moment that Paul would have backed off his message. But notice that he is adamant. And the reason is because his why for ministry is not just success. It's not his acceptance from the wider culture, but his why is quite simply faithfulness to the gospel. Faithfully following Jesus into the ministry that he has been called to. That's Paul's why. His why is not success. His why is faithfulness. Now, this isn't just important for Paul. It's important for us too, because it's easy for us. One of the biggest temptations for the church today is instead of aiming at faithfulness, we can easily chase after trying to be relevant. And so what we end up doing is we chase after gimmicks, or we make compromises to our message, all because we want to be seen as relevant. We want to be accepted by the wider culture. And we think that if we can draw people in with a gimmick, or we can sand off the rough edges of our Christian message, tear out those pages of the Bible that are a little bit harder to embrace, then we'll be okay. I love what the writer Mark Sayers says in response to this. He says, faced with such a discomforting reality, presented with our cultural challenge and our own complicity, we scramble for our solution. We are shaped by a phenomenon that journalist Evgeny Morozov labels as solutionism, the largely arrogant belief that we have the resources and smarts to, under our own steam, solve any problem that confronts us. All we need to do is discover the killer app, and the discomfort we feel, the obstacles we face will disappear. We just need that program, that new expression of church shape, the silver bullet to defeat secularism. But what if there is no killer app? Solutionism is ultimately a belief in novelty and a lack of patience and faith. Solutionism is instant gratification. What if the answer is what it has always been? The path of walking in Jesus' footsteps, of following the traditions and teaching of the apostles. What if the answer to our culture's challenges is still the gospel? What if the answer to our culture's challenges is still the gospel? You see, when we forget our why, and we chase after relevance, and we resort to gimmicks or make compromises, the church loses out. We lose that thing that makes us distinct. We lose our very reason for being. It's not just the church that loses out when we do this. The world loses out too. Because the world doesn't need more gimmicks. The world doesn't need us to make compromises. The world does not need another religion that's chasing after relevance and wide acceptance in the culture. The thing that the world needs is the gospel. The thing the world needs is that message of a God who is so loving, so merciful, so kind, so gracious that he has actually reached down into our brokenness and sin, and he has done something about it by sending his son Jesus into our flesh to go to the cross for us, to die and rise again so that the world, in the face of all of its darkness, would have hope for the future, so that we would have the hope of restoration. That is the message. That is the thing the world needs. And that is the reason, that is our why for ministry. Not relevant gimmicks, not simple success by the numbers, but faithfulness to Jesus. And so we make that our pursuit. And when we get our why straight, when faithfulness to Jesus and proclaiming the gospel to the ends of the earth, when we get that clear, everything else falls into order. Notice the way that it does for Paul as he speaks now of the how that he goes about his ministry. Verse 7, but we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. Notice the way that Paul speaks of how he goes about his ministry. Paul doesn't go about his ministry seeking conflict. Now there is conflict that arises. That's a natural part of faithfulness to the gospel of Jesus. But notice that the how of ministry here is embodied not as Paul going in and stirring up arguments. It is not Paul entering into that city and beginning to name call or shame people. It's Paul getting super defensive about his message and his belief. But the way that Paul speaks of how he goes about his ministry is gentleness and self-sacrifice. That is the how. That is the way that he embodies this ministry that he has been given. Not arguments and self-defense, but humility and gentleness and self-sacrifice. And I think there's a logic to why that is. You see, Paul's how for ministry is ultimately shaped by his why for ministry. You see, friends, our why is the good news of a God who is so gentle, so humble, so kind, so self-giving. When you begin to encounter that God, when you discover more of that God, and when that message works its way into you, you cannot help but bear that message with some of that same gentleness, some of that same humility, some of that same self-sacrifice. When the thing that is at the core of our reason for being is Jesus, who has given himself for the life of the world, as Jesus sort of works his way deep into us, into the very center of our being, we begin to reflect something of who he is. We reflect his gentleness. We reflect his humility. We reflect his self-sacrifice. You see, actually, in 1 Peter, this charge is given to the church to embody the message with this same sort of gentleness. Peter writes in chapter 3, verse 15, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it how? Do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered by those who revile your good behavior in Christ, they may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." Notice here that for Peter, it is not just about the content of the message. It is not just about giving a faithful defense for the reason that the hope that we have. But it's also about the gentle, self-sacrificing lives that the people of God embody. We both speak the gospel with our words, and we also reflect it with the lives that we are called to lead. And I know how challenging this can be. Because I think for many of us, when our faith is challenged, we tend to go into kind of that flight or fight mode, right? It is if someone challenges or has some issue with the faith or makes accusations of Christianity for being simple-minded or stupid or having our head buried in the sand or whatever the case may be, it's easy for us to just go into that flight or fight mode and either want to run from the conversation or get really defensive and think to ourselves, you know what, I need to get into this boxing match here on the internet for Jesus. And as I think about that tendency that exists in me, and I think it exists in many of us, I'm reminded of some wise words that a mentor of mine shared with me when I was in college. There's a pastor that I spent a lot of time with, and he said this was sort of a mantra for him. It was, I don't defend Jesus. Jesus defends me. I don't defend Jesus. Jesus defends me. Now, this isn't saying we don't give witness to our faith or make a clear defense of the gospel. But here's the thing. You don't have to fight for Jesus. Jesus is the one who defeated sin and death. He can fight for himself. Jesus is the one who fights for and defends you. And when we begin to recognize that we don't have to be the defenders, we are defended, that means we're simply set free to share Jesus, to offer the world the gift of Jesus and do it with gentleness, with respect, with patience, with kindness, with humility, and self-sacrifice. And when we get that straight, we are set free to do the what of ministry without fear and without defensiveness. Paul concludes this section. He says in verse 9, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Notice that the what, the thing that Paul and Silas spend their ministry doing, it's just characterized by these three words in verse 12. They exhorted, they encouraged, they charged. So they called people to walk in that manner worthy of God. They encouraged them as they pursued that, and then they charged them, that they sort of gave them ownership of that calling. And notice that as Paul considers his relationship with the Thessalonian Christians in verse 11, he characterizes it as a father with his children. And I think of that, and I think of my relationship with my children. And one of the things that I want for my children, and I think every parent wants for their children, is they want their children to reach maturity. And it's not just because they want them to grow mature so that they can kick them out of the house and they can kind of do their own thing. But you want your children to reach maturity because that's what is good for them, right? That we want our children to grow up and be mature in the way that they handle themselves in relationships, how they treat other people. We want our children to reach maturity in terms of their accountability for their own behavior. We want them to reach maturity in the way that they handle money and the things that they have in life. We want them ultimately to reach maturity in their faith. And as Paul characterizes that maturity, that looks like just simply walking in this manner worthy of God. And notice that language is very similar to the language that Paul uses to characterize why he carries out his ministry. In other words, the what of Paul's ministry is all aimed at drawing more people into the why of his ministry. What Paul longs for above all else is for the Thessalonian Christians to become so wrapped up in the gospel, so wrapped up in who Jesus is, just like he has. You see, I think this is most essential for us right now. Right? Because you know as well as I do that a lot of the what we do in ministry has been forced to change. Now, we're not able to rely on gathering here in person Sunday after Sunday. We're not able to meet in person in community groups the way so many of us long to do right now. We're not able to rely on coaxing students into our building by having meals after every single one of our worship gatherings. There's a lot of what that has been forced to change, and when what we do is forced to change, we need to return to why we exist in the first place. Because our why is what moves us forward. Our why is what calls us to look at the obstacles to our ministry and see them as immense opportunities to expand and change and adapt the way that we carry the gospel into the world, to adapt the way that we live out that mission that we've been given, to mobilize generations to join Jesus on his mission. Some of the what has to change, but the why remains the same. We exist to bring the world the gift of Jesus. Now here's one of the things that I've realized in my own life, and that I've realized from the scriptures, is that we will never become wrapped up in the why of ministry until we recognize who that why is actually for. You see, here's what I mean, is I think for many of us, we become enthralled with the gospel, either when we first come to faith or when we kind of first reach maturity in faith. And we recognize its beauty and its depth and the gift that it is for us, but so often what happens is that message of the gospel, we get so familiar with it, and it just sort of becomes the furniture in the room of our lives, and we think that the gospel was for us when we came into the faith, but now it's this thing in the background. And now Christianity, for me, now that I'm a mature believer, it's all about what I do, how hard I work, how many people I share this message with, and we forget that the gospel is still for us. Wherever you are, the gospel, that gift of God's Son, Jesus Christ, given for the life of the world, is still for you. It's not in the background. It's that thing that shapes your very being and reality. It's that reminder that day after day you have a God who works to give himself for you to draw you into his own kingdom and his own glory. So friends, may you come to know the why of the church. May you come to know this Jesus who is gentle, who is humble, who is kind, and who came seeking not his own glory, not the praise of men, but came seeking obedience and faithfulness to the Father, even when that obedience was life. May you know this Jesus who has worked to draw you into his own kingdom, who invites you to receive his very glory. Friends, may you find your life